The war had no end. For centuries, the Zarkari Empire and the Veltran Dominion had fought across the stars, destroying planets, wiping out entire civilizations, and burning everything in their path. No one even remembered how the war started. The records had been lost, the reasons forgotten. But the bloodshed never stopped. Every species in the galaxy knew one thing: this war would never end. The Zarkari were brutal conquerors. Their massive warships, covered in thick armor, moved like floating fortresses. They believed in overwhelming power, crushing their enemies through sheer force. Entire planets fell under their rule, their people enslaved or executed. The Veltran, on the other hand, were tactical masterminds. They used speed, strategy, and deception to win their battles. Their ships were faster, their weapons precise, and their commanders ruthless. They fought not to conquer, but to ensure the Zarkari never ruled the galaxy. For centuries, the war had raged on, a constant cycle of attack, counterattack, betrayal, and revenge. No side could win. No side would stop. The war had shaped the galaxy itself. Trade routes were abandoned. Once thriving civilizations now lay in ruins. Neutral species stayed hidden, avoiding the conflict at all costs. Some planets had been bombed so many times that they were nothing but floating debris in space. But despite everything, neither the Zarkari nor the Veltran could claim victory. They had used every weapon, every strategy, every possible way to destroy each other. Yet after all these years, the war remained at a standstill. Until now. Far away, beyond the main battle lines, a new player had entered the scene: humanity. The humans were small in number, their technology primitive compared to the great empires. The Zarkari and Veltran barely paid attention to them, seeing them as nothing more than an unimportant species. But the humans had been watching. They had studied the war, learned its patterns, and understood its weaknesses. And soon, the war that had lasted for centuries was about to change forever. The Zarkari and Veltran had fought for so long that they no longer questioned the war. It was all they knew. Every generation was raised to fight, to hate the enemy, and to believe that victory would come someday. But no one questioned why it never did. On the edges of the battlefield, fleets clashed in the darkness of space. Gigantic warships rained destruction upon each other, filling the void with fire and wreckage. The Zarkari, with their massive, heavily armored battleships, charged forward like an unstoppable force. The Veltran, in their sleek, fast cruisers, struck like assassins, dodging the Zarkari's fire and hitting them where it hurt the most. Neither side realized that they were trapped in a cycle, repeating the same battles, the same victories, the same defeats, again and again. The galaxy had accepted this war as eternal. No one expected change. But far from the main conflict, on a quiet, forgotten planet, something was happening. Something that would change the war forever. A fleet of ships had arrived. Small ships, unimpressive. Their designs were unfamiliar, their engines humming with an energy that felt alien to both the Zarkari and the Veltran. They did not belong to either empire. They belonged to humanity. The humans were new to the galactic stage. Unlike the Zarkari and Veltran, they had not spent centuries at war, but what they lacked in experience, they made up for in something far more dangerous. They were unpredictable. The humans had studied the war before stepping into it. They had watched the battles, learned the strengths and weaknesses of both sides, and seen what neither empire had ever admitted. They were both blind. The Zarkari were powerful but arrogant. Their strength had made them lazy, unable to adapt. They relied on the same brute force tactics that had worked for generations, unwilling to change. The Veltran were brilliant but overconfident. Their strategies were sharp, their technology advanced. But they were predictable. Their patterns could be read, their moves anticipated. And humanity. They had no pattern. The first time the humans appeared on the battlefield, no one even noticed. It was a minor skirmish, another battle in a war of endless battles. A Zarkari dreadnought was hammering a Veltran command ship, its plasma cannons reducing enemy shields to nothing. It was an easy victory, one of thousands. Then something strange happened. The Zarkari dreadnought lost control of its engines. One moment, it was charging forward, its weapons locked on target. The next, its massive hull jerked to a stop, as if an invisible hand had grabbed it. The ship's systems flickered, its weapons went offline, and the crew panicked. Before anyone could react, a small, insignificant-looking human ship drifted past the battlefield. No weapons fired, no explosions, no grand attack, just a silent, unnoticed ship slipping between the warring fleets like a shadow. Seconds later, the Zarkari dreadnought's reactor overloaded. A moment of silence followed. Then, boom! The entire ship erupted in a blinding explosion, tearing itself apart from the inside. The Veltran ships immediately moved in to finish the job, raining fire on the Zarkari forces. On the surface, it looked like a simple malfunction. Bad luck. A rare reactor failure. No one suspected the truth. The humans had done it, without firing a single shot, and they were only getting started. The battle raged on, but something had changed. The Veltran believed they had gotten lucky, a Zarkari dreadnought malfunctioning at the perfect time. It was a rare gift, but they weren't about to question it. They pressed their attack, forcing the Zarkari into retreat. The Zarkari, on the other hand, were furious. Their warship had failed in a way that should have been impossible. In the chaos, no one noticed the small human vessel as it drifted away, slipping back into the darkness of space. But that was only the beginning. The next battle came 2 days later, near a shattered moon orbiting a dead world. A Veltran fleet had gathered, preparing to strike a critical Zarkari outpost. If they could take it, they would cut off the Zarkari's supply lines, starving their forces in this sector. Victory here could shift the war in their favor, at least for a while. But the Zarkari knew. Their spies had warned them. When the Veltran fleet arrived, they found waiting warships, fully armed and ready for battle. A trap. The Zarkari fired first. Massive plasma bolts cut through the darkness, crashing into Veltran shields. Fighters swarmed the battlefield, their engines screaming as they twisted and turned in chaotic dogfights. The Veltran were fast, dodging, weaving, retaliating, but the Zarkari's sheer firepower was overwhelming. Then something happened. The Veltran's targeting systems failed. In the middle of battle, their weapons suddenly stopped locking onto the enemy ships. Their advanced tracking systems, designed to predict and strike with deadly precision, went dark. Panic spread. Some ships tried to fire manually, but their shots missed. Others hesitated, confused, trying to reboot their systems. In just seconds, the Veltran went from a coordinated fleet to a disorganized mess. The Zarkari seized the moment. Their weapons tore through Veltran cruisers. Explosions lit up space as ship after ship was destroyed. The Veltran's ambush had turned into a slaughter. But then something even stranger happened. A Zarkari battleship, one of their largest, heavily armored and armed with devastating cannons, suddenly lost control. It stopped moving. It drifted for a few seconds, then its main reactor detonated. A shockwave rippled through the battlefield, sending debris flying in all directions. The Zarkari fleet, caught off guard, hesitated. Confusion filled their comm channels. Then a second warship exploded. Then a third. Without warning, Zarkari ships were tearing themselves apart. Reactors overloading, weapons malfunctioning, engines failing. The Veltran were stunned, but they weren't about to waste the opportunity. Their systems suddenly came back online. No one knew why. No one had time to question it. The Veltran opened fire. Within minutes, the Zarkari fleet was in full retreat. Across the galaxy, commanders from both sides tried to make sense of what had happened. The Veltran celebrated their victory, but their top strategists were uneasy. That battle had been lost. Their fleet had been outmatched, outgunned, outmaneuvered. Yet somehow, The Zarkari had fallen apart. On the Zarkari side, the fury was even greater. A trap that should have crushed the Veltrin had turned into disaster. Their best ships had failed at the worst possible moments. It couldn't be a coincidence. Someone was interfering. But who? Neither side suspected the truth. Neither side even knew that humanity existed. Aboard a hidden human vessel, Commander Elias Ford watched the battle's final moments on his holographic display. That's 3 engagements, his second in command. Lieutenant Suri Patel said, 3 battles where we've turned the tide without firing a single shot. Ford nodded, his eyes locked on the wreckage. And they still have no idea we're here. How long until they notice? Doesn't matter, Ford said. By the time they figure it out, this war will already be over. He turned to his crew. Prepare for the next operation. Let's show them what real strategy looks like. The war was spiraling out of control. Across the galaxy, Veltrin and Zarkari forces clashed in brutal battles that left entire planets in ruins. Both sides had been locked in this conflict for centuries, and neither had been able to gain a true advantage. Until now. Strange things were happening. Ships malfunctioned at the worst possible moments. Targeting systems failed. Enemy fleets collapsed from within, as if some invisible force had turned their own weapons against them. At first, both sides blamed each other. The Veltrin thought the Zarkari had developed some terrifying new weapon, one that could disable ships remotely. The Zarkari suspected the Veltrin had found some hidden technology left behind by an ancient civilization. But neither side had any proof. And neither side knew the truth. Because the real force behind the war's sudden shift wasn't Veltrin or Zarkari. It was humanity. Aboard the hidden human command ship Eclipse, Commander Elias Ford studied the galactic war map. The Veltrin and Zarkari were moving their forces like pieces on a chessboard, but they had no idea that another player had already joined the game. His crew worked in silence, monitoring enemy transmissions, hacking into battle networks, feeding false information into strategic command centers. Lieutenant Suri Patel sat at a terminal, her fingers moving rapidly over a holographic interface. We've intercepted a Zarkari fleet transmission. Looks like they're moving 3 heavy warships toward the Brenza system. If they get there, the Veltrin colony is finished. Ford leaned in. This was their moment. Are their security systems still compromised? Completely, Shuri confirmed. They don't even know we're inside. Ford smirked. Then let's make sure those warships don't make it. The 3 Zarkari warships hurtled through space, their engines burning bright as they made their way toward the Brenza system. The fleet commander, High Warlord Kothar, sat in the command chair of the battleship Prothak, his reptilian eyes locked on the stars ahead. This will be a glorious victory, he growled, speaking to his officers. The Veltrin will fall, and we will carve our names into history. His officers cheered. They never saw it coming. Deep in the warship system, buried beneath thousands of lines of code, a tiny, almost invisible command activated. It spread like a silent virus, jumping from system to system, rewriting protocols, overriding controls. The ship's shields flickered. Engine power dropped by half. At first, the crew didn't notice. But then, without warning, the ship stopped moving. Alarms blared. Warlord Kothar shot to his feet. What is happening? A terrified officer checked the controls. I don't know. The engines, they've shut down. Then restart them, Kothar bellowed. The officer's fingers flew over the console, but something was wrong. The system wasn't responding. It was as if some invisible force had taken control of the ship. And then, the worst happened. Their weapons came online. But they weren't targeting the enemy. They were targeting each other. The battleship Prothak suddenly fired all forward cannons, directly into the second Zarkari warship, Dravok. The impact was devastating. Explosions tore through the hull. The Dravok's captain screamed over the comms, demanding answers, but no one had any. Before anyone could react, the Dravok's own torpedoes launched at the third warship, the Gathric. The Gathric's commander barely had time to shout before the torpedoes hit their mark. 2 warships were already burning, and the Vrothak, its reactor suddenly overloaded. The crew barely had time to scream before the ship erupted in a massive explosion, sending a shockwave across space. In less than 60 seconds, the entire fleet was gone. Across the galaxy, Veltran commanders stared at their sensors in disbelief. Did we just win? One of them whispered. They hadn't even fired a shot. The Veltran were about to celebrate, until they realized something chilling. This wasn't their doing. Some unknown force had just wiped out a Zarkari fleet in seconds. And whoever they were, they had the power to turn the tide of war in ways no one had imagined. The Veltran didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified. Aboard the Eclipse, Ford exhaled slowly as he watched the last wreckage drift into space. "That's another battle we've ended before it even began," Shuri said, shaking her head. Ford folded his arms. "We can keep doing this, keep taking them apart piece by piece, but sooner or later they're going to realize. And when they do," Ford's eyes darkened, "then we show them exactly what humanity is capable of." The war had raged for so long that neither side could imagine an ending. Veltran and Zarkari forces had fought for centuries, their hatred fueling endless destruction. Planets burned. Fleets were torn apart. Generations grew up knowing only war. But something was changing. Whispers spread among the soldiers. Some claimed that unseen hands were guiding battles, shifting the tides without explanation. Others reported entire fleets disappearing without a trace. And now something impossible had happened. A Zarkari fleet had destroyed itself. In the Veltran War Council chamber, High Commander Joreth stared at the battle reports in disbelief. "How?" he demanded, slamming his fist onto the table. 3 of their warships wiped out without a single Veltran shot fired. His advisors hesitated. Some unknown force compromised their systems. One officer admitted, "We detected strange signal patterns just before the incident. They weren't Veltran signals. They weren't Zarkari either." Joreth narrowed his eyes. "Then who?" Silence. The Veltran had spent centuries studying their enemies. There were no unknown factions in this war. The galaxy had been divided between them and the Zarkari for longer than anyone could remember. If some new force was intervening, it could change everything. "Find out who did this," Joreth ordered. "And if they are on our side, I want to speak with them." On the other side of the war, Warlord Krenzik of the Zarkari stood before his shattered fleet, his scales burning with rage. The wreckage of 3 mighty warships floated in space. Their crews were gone. Krenzik clenched his claws. "This was no accident," he growled. "No battle error." His voice was filled with fury. This was sabotage. His officers looked nervous. "But Warlord, we have no proof." "Find me proof," Krenzik roared. "Who did this? Who dares interfere with the Zarkari?" He knew it wasn't the Veltran. If they had this kind of power, they would have used it long ago. This was something new, and that meant it was a threat. Krenzik turned to his war strategist. "Deploy spy drones. Hack every frequency. If there is a shadow enemy in this war, I want them exposed." His voice dropped into a dangerous whisper. "And then, I want them crushed." Aboard the Eclipse, Commander Elias Ford watched as his secret war continued. Humanity had stayed hidden for years, working in the shadows, slowly unraveling both sides of the war. But now the Veltran were searching for them. And the Zarkari. They were hunting them. Lieutenant Shuri Patol looked at Ford with concern. "Sir, our interference is no longer subtle. The Veltran are asking questions. The Zarkari are looking for us. If they figure out who we are." "They won't," Ford said firmly. Shuri hesitated. "And if they do?" Ford stared at the holographic battlefield in front of him. He could see the war shifting, battle by battle. For the first time in centuries, both sides were starting to hesitate. But hesitation wasn't enough. The war had to end. "If they figure out who we are, Ford said, his voice calm but cold. Then they'll learn the truth. Shuri frowned. Which is? Ford's eyes hardened. That humanity doesn't lose wars ***. He turned to his crew. Prepare the next phase. We're not just going to turn the tide anymore. A deadly glint flashed in his eyes. We're going to end this war. The battlefield was no longer the same. The war that had lasted for centuries was unraveling, and both the Veltran and the Zarkari knew something was deeply wrong. Warlord Krenzek stood inside his command chamber, his claws gripping the edge of the war table. He glared at the tactical display. Battle after battle, strange disruptions had occurred. Entire warships had been disabled in seconds. Weapons had failed at critical moments. Command channels had been hijacked. This was not a natural war anymore. Someone, was pulling the strings. And now, Krenzek had found them. "Show me," he growled. A Zarkari technician pressed a sequence on the console. A grainy transmission played, captured from one of their spy probes. The image showed a strange fleet in deep space. It was small, no more than a dozen ships. But they weren't Veltran. They weren't Zarkari. And they weren't using any known technology. Krenzek's slitted eyes narrowed as he studied the unknown ships. They were sleek, efficient, and terrifyingly precise. Not a single wasted movement. Then the image zoomed in. A face appeared. A species Krenzek had never seen before. A species with round faces, small eyes, pale skin. Humans. On the Eclipse, Commander Elias Ford watched the war table. The final moves were coming together. For years, humanity had been dismantling this war from the shadows, infiltrating systems, corrupting AI, feeding false intelligence, turning weapons against their owners. Now the Veltran were searching for them, and the Zarkari had finally found them. "They know," Shuri Patel said, standing beside him. Her voice was calm, but tense. "The Zarkari spotted one of our decoy fleets. It won't take them long to track us." Ford exhaled slowly. He had expected this moment, planned for it. "Then it's time to finish what we started," he said. Shuri hesitated. "Are you sure? We could still stay in the shadows. Let them tear each other apart." Ford turned to her, his expression unreadable. "They won't stop," he said, "not unless someone makes them." He tapped the war table, bringing up Phase 3. "The war ends today," he said, "and we're going to make sure it never starts again." On the Veltran homeworld, High Commander Joreth was pacing. Reports flooded in. Zarkari fleets were acting erratic. Warships were breaking formation. Command channels were filled with chaos. And worst of all, they had intercepted a transmission. Joreth clenched his jaw as he stared at the frozen image. A human. Something ancient stirred in his memory. Stories told long ago. A species that had disappeared from history. A species that was rumored to be too dangerous to exist. The humans. "They are real," he whispered. His officers looked at him in shock. "Commander." Joreth took a slow breath. "Tell the fleet to hold position." Gasps filled the chamber. "Sir, the Zarkari are preparing an assault." "If we don't." "Hold position," Joreth repeated. Because if the humans were truly back, then everything was about to change. And this war, it was no longer between the Veltran and the Zarkari. It was between the old galaxy and whatever force had just stepped out of the shadows. Warlord Krenzek's ship moved through space at full speed. "Prepare for battle," he roared. The humans had been hiding for too long. The Zarkari would not be controlled. They would fight. "Engage all weapons," Krenzek commanded. "I want them wiped out." His warship powered up. Energy surged through its core. Targeting systems locked onto the human fleet. And then, everything shut down. The screens flickered. The lights died. Every system failed. Krenzek staggered back. His claws twitched as he realized what had happened. The humans hadn't come to fight. They had come to end the war. And they had already won. Krenzik stood frozen on the bridge of his flagship, staring at the dead screens around him. His heart pounded in his chest, his claws flexing uselessly at his sides. The hum of power that had always filled his warship was gone. The ship wasn't just disabled. It was dead. He wasn't alone. Across the fleet, thousands of Zarkari warriors were realizing the same terrifying truth. Their warships, their weapons, their mighty engines of destruction, all silenced in an instant. And the Veltrin. They were suffering the exact same fate. Krenzik turned to his officers, their reptilian faces twisted in shock and confusion. "Restart the engines," he growled. "Now." "Commander," one of his technicians swallowed hard. "The systems, they're unresponsive." "Then override them," Krenzik bellowed. The technician hesitated, then pressed a button on the console. The moment his clawed finger touched the control panel, a sound echoed through the entire ship. A voice. Cold. Calm. Human. "Stand down," it said. "This war is over." Krenzik's blood ran cold. On the Eclipse, Commander Elias Ford watched the enemy fleets drifting helplessly in space. He folded his arms as his team monitored the massive display in front of them. Thousands of enemy ships, once locked in a war that had lasted for centuries, now hung in silence, unable to move, unable to fire. "They're in shock," Shri Patil muttered beside him. "They should be," Ford replied. Their entire way of life just collapsed in 5 hours. The operation had gone exactly as planned. The shutdown virus, a marvel of human cyber warfare, had infiltrated every system on both sides, shutting down weapons, engines, and communications in perfect synchronization. The Veltran and Zarkari had been stripped of their ability to fight. "Incoming transmission," a communications officer announced, "from the Veltran homeworld." Ford nodded. "Put it through." A hologram flickered to life in front of them. High Commander Joreth of the Veltran appeared, his feline features tense, his golden eyes unreadable. "Human," Joreth said, his voice carefully measured. "I assume this is your doing." Ford nodded. "It is." Joreth's claws tapped against the armrest of his chair. "And what happens now?" Ford didn't hesitate. "That depends on you." Joreth studied him for a long moment. Then, with a slow exhale, he leaned back in his chair. "You could have destroyed us," he said. "But you didn't." Ford nodded. "We could have. But humans don't fight wars for conquest. We fight to end them." A silence stretched between them. Then Joreth gave a slow nod. "I will stand down," he said, "on one condition." Ford raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" Joreth's golden eyes burned with quiet intensity. "Tell me the truth," he said. "Are you gods?" Ford let out a short, dry chuckle. "No," he said. "We're just humans." Joreth nodded slowly, as if that answer was even more terrifying than the alternative. Meanwhile, aboard the Zarkari flagship, Krenzik was not as willing to surrender. "Unacceptable," he roared, slamming his fist against the dead console. "We are warriors. We do not bow to an enemy that hides in the shadows." His officers, however, were not listening. Their weapons no longer worked. Their defenses were useless. Their mighty warships were drifting like corpses. For the first time in Zarkari history, they were powerless. "Sir," one of his captains spoke hesitantly, "perhaps we should reconsider our position." Krenzik turned to him, his eyes blazing. "You would have us surrender." The captain met his gaze without flinching. "I would have us survive." Krenzik's claws twitched. He wanted to fight. He wanted to win. But there was no war left to fight. The humans had already won. And deep down, Krenzik knew, if he pushed forward, if he resisted, if he tried to start the war again, humanity wouldn't hesitate to finish it for good. With a slow breath, he lowered his head. "Send a message to the Veltran," he said through gritted teeth. "Tell them, we accept peace." His words tasted like ash. But even Krenzik knew when a battle was truly lost. On the Eclipse, Ford watched as the final messages came in. Veltran forces, standing down. Zarkari forces, ceasefire confirmed. The war was over, and it had taken only 5 hours. Suri Patel exhaled, shaking her head in disbelief. I almost can't believe it. Ford smirked. Believe it. She glanced at him. So what now? Ford turned to the massive display of the silent battlefield. Now, he said, we make sure this war never happens again. Humanity had come. Humanity had ended the war. And now, the galaxy would never be the same.